to create the back stitch, we're actually going to need twice as much thread as we would need for the running stitch, for instance. The running stitch, we just need enough thread to go across whatever it is that we're stitching. But with the back stitch, we go back and forth. We keep stitching backwards a little bit every time. So we actually need at least twice as much as what we're doing. So if this here is the line that I'm doing, I want to make sure that I have at least, plus a little extra, of course, twice as much as that. So that plus that. So I've got about twice as much plus my little tail. So that should do it, but you want to make sure you have at least twice as much for that back stitch. Maybe even 2.5 times, just to be safe. So, like always, we're going to start by coming up from behind. I have a knot on the end, and I've got 3 pieces of embroidery floss here. Now for the back stitch, every time that we stitch, we're going to go back the same distance that we go forward. So I'm going to back it up, and then I'm going to come out of that next dot there and pull it through. Now I'm going to back it up to where my last stitch is. I'm going to go in that same hole there and then forward, past that stitch that we just did to the next hole. And pull it through. So that I have no space in between each of the stitches. And then on the back side, my stitches actually overlap each other. And so while you're doing this, make sure you're checking on both the front and back side so that you know that it looks the way that it should look. So again, we're going to go in that same hole that we came out, or went in before, I should say. And then we're going to come back out the next mark. So passing over where our thread is coming out of. And pull it tight. And beautiful. And then again, going backwards, so that's the back stitch. And then going past where we are to the next one. A little too far. And about there looks good. And pull it through. And that's the back stitch. And so as you can see, I have a completed line of the blue. And like I mentioned before, the brown is actually 3 pieces of embroidery floss. The blue is 4. So you can see there is a little bit of a difference. You can also see that it definitely sits on top of the fabric pretty well. So it's a nice decorative stitch. It also holds the fabric together really, really well. As you can see, because of all that back stitching, it is super secure, and I can't pull my thread out no matter what I tug. If I was to tug on my running stitch, I could just pull it right out. So this is a super secure stitch. It's great for outlining things because it creates a nice solid line. You can see that when it's done with the sewing machine thread, it's nice and thin. So you could mark something really well with that without creating too much visual interest on there, if you want to just lightly define something. Additionally, we can also use it as a decorative stitch, which I have here. So this is your traditional back stitch, right, where we actually create a solid line. But I can create a variation of it by changing the size of the stitches, sort of like what we did with the running stitch. So you can see here, I still have that same crisscrossing over effect, but it's much, much smaller because I made little tiny stitches on the front instead of larger stitches. So I'll show you how I did that real quick. So similar to how we did this part here, what I want to do is I'm only going to back it up a tiny bit. So I'm going to back it up right here. So I'm only creating a little tiny stitch on the front. And then up to that next hole. And pull it through. And then I can do another one of those. So I'm only going to back it up just a tiny little bit for that stitch. And then go to the next one. And so you can see I am creating a space in between, so it's not a traditional backstitch, but it's still the same motion. It's still just as secure, but it's a little decorative variation. And so before I pull this through, I'll show you what the other side looks like. So you can see here, I'm going in just before. So that's my backstitch. It's just a cute little one. And then the other side is where my larger stitch is happening. So it's just a tiny little back stitch happening here. And then a big stitch on the back side. Like that. And so, like I said, with the running stitch, we can use, like I have here, which is 1/4 of an inch in between each mark. Or we could make them little tiny 1/8 of an inch ones. Which I believe is what I did up here. This one has 1/8 of an inch in between each dot. So it's much, much smaller, tiny. We can also work with centimeters. I find centimeters are a good distance apart. It's kind of in between 1/8 and 1/4. But so as you can see, with marking those little dots, we get these beautiful, nice, even stitches, which it's very, very hard to do without the markings. So it just takes a lot of practice, but you'll see some older ladies that are seamstresses that can do this. It's mind-blowing how perfect they are, and they don't need to mark it. They just can do it. It's amazing. It's really, really amazing to watch when you see it. So those are our two super basic, simple stitches, the running stitch and the back stitch, and we can do so much with both of those. Like I said, for both construction and for decorative purposes. And then next we're going to move on to some more decorative stuff, like what we have here. So the next video we'll talk about the chain stitch and these little dots, and we'll do some other fun little things too.